What's up everyone? Today we're going to be looking at the pacing of a game in Marvel Crisis Protocol with a few examples with some rosters. But first of all, we're going to be looking at what I mean by pacing is how fast a game is going to end. And this, as you might have noticed, changes a lot based on the scenarios present, right? So here I've got a quick layout of like the speed for the different scenarios, right, going from the slowest stuff to the fastest. So as you can notice, one thing to note for when you're building your roster, there's quite a few more options for secures that are slow than and extracts are like, you know, a bit more limited, while for the really fast scoring, it goes mostly through the extracts, which is something we're going to look at more in depth later in the video, the implications, but normally just keep it in the back of your mind, right? And the middle speed, right, is going to be mostly secures with very few extracts. All right, what I mean by the different speeds, right, is everything here is 3 victory points or less. Outside of Gamma Wave, which can potentially be 4, right, if you control your opponent's shelter, but generally speaking, it generates 3 victory points per round, having this secure on the field. While something like Alien Ship is going to generate normally 3 victory points maximum also, right? All these are going to be more like 5 to 6 victory points, and the stuff in the middle is 4. So what that does is that if we look at this speed, right, let's start with the slowest stuff. Let's say you got a game on Intrusions and Alien Ship. If you wonder how fast this kind of game goes, you can add up both scenarios' victory points total, right? So in this case, 3 and 3 for 6. Divided, assuming both players fight for them roughly equally, you would get a game where both players would score 3 victory points a round. Which means that every round, if both players fight equally, we're looking at on round 5 times 3, 15 victory points for both players. On round 5, it's possible that no one has won yet. And it might be less depending on days, it might also be a bit more, right? So as you can see, if both scenarios are scoring 3 victory points, it's very likely that the game is ending on round 5 or 6. It could happen on round 4, right? If somebody can go 4-2 every round, roughly 4-2, right? So that they would score 4 times 4, 16. So there's a small chance, but it's really unlikely. More often than not, you're looking at a round 5 win, because if both players would be scoring 15, it's very easy for someone to like break that parity and sneak in an extra victory point for the 16-14 ending, right? But that's on round 5. That's what I mean by the pacing, right? So whenever you're playing a scenario combination, if you're unsure about what it's going to lead to in terms of speed of play, you can always count up the scenario total, and that's going to give you a good idea, right? Like here, for instance, right, we've got 4 and 3, so 7 should mean a 4-3 split. Now, if the same player manages to keep that 4-3 lead for the whole game, they would reach 16 victory points on round 4, while their opponent would be at 12. It's unlikely. Normally, people end up splitting it at some point. Keep in mind at 7 points around, you're already looking at potentially a round 4 win. Which, by the way, round 4 is like the most common round for games of Marvel Crisis Protocol to end on. Unless you're playing on those 6-7 points game, where then it's really often round 5. Because if you look at 7, right, you could think of it that way, right? So there's 7 points scored on round 1, 7 on round 2, etc. So assuming that everything is scored, by round 5, there's been 35 points scored. 35 points is enough that both players are at over 6, potentially both over 16. Right? Yeah, 35, so like this is 30, this is 31, so there's 4 extra victory points left, so like it's probably gonna be ending like, it's hard to say exactly, but maybe like 18 to like 17 be the ending on round 5, right? Assuming everything is scored every round. So, but we're looking at a round 5 ending, and it's almost impossible for that kind of scenario combination to go to round 6. It's possible because, right, some games where like not everything is scored, depending on the secure, depending on the extract, not everything is always going to be scored, so it could end on round 6. But assuming that both players manage to score everything, we're looking at a round 5 ending. And if we go for the classic mid-range speed with both being at 4 victory points, then if both players tie everything on round 4, both players have 16 victory points, which would mean a round 5 potentially. But we're saying potentially because it's very likely that at least one player manages to either score one more or just stop their opponent from scoring, you know, one point, so without necessarily getting it. So it could end 17-15. Is something you'll often see, or maybe just 16-15 or like 16-14. You know, there's a lot of different variations to this, but bear in mind, once you reach that 8 victory point total available on the field, we're looking at a round 4 end. And then if we go into even faster scoring, right? Like say, when you reach the 9 victory points is where the game starts to become potentially a round 3 ending. And it's going to end on round 3 way more often than you expect it to, due to a few different reasons. But right on round 3 of a 9-point game, there's 27 points scored. So that means that somebody can be at 16 and the other player at 11. And you might be thinking, but shouldn't it be closer? What happens with a game that ends on round 3 is like, if you get a model daze at the wrong time, or your opponent manages to daze your model at the perfect time, depending on the point of view, they could just score a few extra points that you weren't expecting. Or if they're playing like a team with a lot of extract focus shenanigans and a lot of control, they could score a lot. And by extract focus shenanigans, I mean models like that can grab extracts from your opponent without really having to daze them, like something like Black Cat with Master Cat Burglar, right? Or Dr. Voodoo with Possession to like generate a lot of victory points. Pyro with Pyrotechnics can do it, even though that's less reliable. Or like something like Spider-Woman's Spender, which makes people drop objectives, you know. Those kind of models can generate that shift in victory point really fast. So if your opponent is bringing a lot of these models and a lot of fast scoring stuff, expect them to try to win on round 3 or 4 if stuff doesn't necessarily go entirely as planned. Of course, if most players trade fairly evenly, you're looking at a 5-4 on one round, and then 5, let's assume they manage to flip it up, both players could be at 9 on round 2, right? And then round 3, somebody would need to score 7 out of this 9 points, so that's less likely. Then you'd maybe be looking at like a 13-14 game maybe on round 3, and then there's a round 4, but it's really unlikely to go past that because on round 4 you'd have 36 victory points total available. If you take 36 and divide it by 2, that's 18 victory points each. So if both players are at 18, it's very likely someone is at 17 and the other player at 19 or something like that, due to just trying to push for that little extra point, right? And then if you look at the stuff that goes even higher, right, like Superpowered Scoundrels, for instance, now we're looking at a 10 victory point game. It means that on round 3, there's 30 points scored total. We're looking at both players being at 15. As I've mentioned so often already, right, somebody's probably going to be dazing a model, pushing a model off of an objective, stealing an objective, something along those lines, and hopefully generate that little extra to sneak in that victory at 16-14 on round 3. So like, it's very rare that those super high scoring games go past round 3. So what does that mean? It means that when you're building your roster, you want to first of all make sure that you bring scenarios that fit with the kind of game plan you want, right? If you're playing a team that has a lot of momentum, like the Avengers can do, right, with the Avengers discount, then you normally want to leverage this into a lot of superpowers that gives you a lot of efficiency for scoring, right? It's one of the strengths, the best strength of this leadership is just getting a lot of like superpowers to control your opponent and score way faster than them, and then put a lot of pressure through the scenario. So if you're playing a team like Avengers with Steve, you probably want mostly faster scoring objectives, right? Then there's of course like the type of shapes you want. There's other details to go through, but like purely speed-wise, probably want something that's faster. Well, if you look at Inhumans, that also have a good leadership for momentum, but they don't have as much displacement in an affiliation. Their leader is also just mostly really good at beating up people. So you're looking at a slower paced game to leverage the strength of the leadership over multiple rounds. Then you probably want overall slower scoring scenarios, right? Like these are examples, or both teams I've used in tournaments in the past. They're pretty good. If you want to copy them, feel free. Otherwise, it's mostly just to showcase, right, examples of the kind of thinking that goes behind it, right? And if you're not certain what you want with your theme, then you can always like take the time to explore. But in general, if you want to play like a lot of models that are good at dazing and KOing your opponent's model, then normally you're going to be better off with a longer game. As if you take a model off of the table on round 3, but the game ends on round 3, you don't get the chance to leverage that advantage as much as if the game goes to round 5 or 6, right? And then we're also gonna go real quick into this aspect, right? So just to recap, right? Games will end on round roughly 4 more often than not, right? Roughly round 4. So keep this in mind when you're making your decisions. But always take the time to count the number of points that are available, because that's going to influence the type of models you want to bring to the game, right? If it's a game that you know is going to be slower paced, then you can bring your models that are more attrition focused and want to like brawl, daze, KO your opponent. And if you know it's going to be a game that ends on round 3, you probably want to bring more the models with a lot of displacement that are super mobile and able to like help you contest objectives, score victory points, you know, and overall help you out with staying in the game and or winning it fast. While if your opponent, right, well, if it's a longer paced game, you're probably looking at models that are going to be able to dish out more damage. Like, for instance, in this Avenger squad, it's mostly Sabertooth. That's your more for this, but then or maybe her sometimes with Interrogate, you know, like ways to like get the game going for longer and like leverage some advantages, right? Yeah, so that's the first thing you want to keep in mind. And then if you have priority, let's just throw this here because like it kind of fits with what we're talking about. If you have priority and you've never played against your opponent's list and or maybe their affiliation, and you don't know what to choose in between your extracts and your secures, one trick that I can give you that I've used in the past. I don't use it as much now because I have a much better understanding of the game, but when I was starting out, it was one of the ways I would figure out when I wasn't certain, right? So for instance, if you're the Inhumans player or the Avengers player, you're gonna figure out the same thing. It goes both ways, right? What you want to do is look at your opponent's secures and extracts, even before, like, even if you don't understand what their model does or whatever, like, just look at that and it's going to help you out, right? So what I do is I count the total victory points available in one section, right? So for instance, in the extracts for the Inhumans player, we've got a 4, 3, and 3 points, right? That's how many points they can generate. It's the same thing in their secures, right? So 4, 3, 3, so a total of 10 victory points. So no matter which combination I would choose, it would put out roughly the same, a similar pacing, right? Either like average or slow. If you look at the Avengers player, you're gonna see it's similar-ish, but on the secures it's more mid-range, right? 4, 4, 4. So 4, 8, 12. Well, if we look at the we've got 5, 9, right? 4, 8, 12, 5, 9, 12. Same thing. Except Legacy Virus got that little, you know, shenanigan where if somebody assembles them, then they score 6 victory points. So that like means that like there's a bit more of a threat on the extract side overall from the Avengers player, right? Like their extracts are going to be faster scoring overall, while the secures are all, you know, the same. If I were the Inhumans player and I had priority, I would choose my extracts because that way I know the game is going to be a bit slower paced overall. I would also be playing Legacy Virus, which is always a risk against Avengers because they're really good at assembling it. So that's always a risk. But, you know, overall the game would be slower. While if it were the other way around. If I were Avengers, same thing. I would choose my extracts because the main one I'm hoping to get here is probably the cubes, as this is really like the one that really paces the game at a much faster pace than everything else, and then I would get to leverage all of my tools that scenario. Like that's how you would look at it. And then if you were Avengers and went priority, you choose your extracts, and then the other player would choose his secures, which would create a game right in the end 5-3, so 8 points. So we're back to that mid-rangey game, but it's going to be mostly extract focused for this, for the scoring. And if you look over here, you're going to see, right, like I mentioned earlier, that a lot of the fast scoring stuff comes through the extract, while more of the slow scoring comes through. So what that means is normally if you want to leverage that speed and fast scoring, controlling extracts is really strong. One of the reasons that model like Black Cat, Dr. Voodoo, Pyro now, Rhino is also an amazing one with This Is a Robbery. she's also like pretty interesting for this, but like there's quite a few models now that like really like are good at dominating extracts, and those models normally in fast scoring games become really a premium. So even if you're playing attrition, I highly recommend that you try to have at least some plans for this, because you're going to be facing that at some point in the tournament. So that should sum it up for this one, right, about the pacing of the game. So if you see, right, we'd be looking at a 8 to potentially 9 victory point game with the Gamma Wave extra VP, and that's where as the Avenger player, for instance, I would try to sneak it in at some point while holding ideally more cubes than my opponent, and I could see myself winning this game on round 3, potentially, or a pretty easy round 4 win, right? Because round 1, if I were to hold 3 cubes and my back pointer would score 4, my opponent would also score, right? Holding the center, right? I would assume I'd get those 3 cubes, one would get those 2, and the center, but then on round 2, I'd be aiming at pushing for grabbing the center and or their back point at some point to get in the extra victory point, depending on how many what's the stretch we're playing at, and then look to like maybe get that 9-7 on round 2, and then maybe make a really big push for round 3. Like there's some ways like maybe win on round 3, but it's unlikely. Very more likely to win round 4 by going to 16 and making sure my opponent's like at 15 or something. But that then like the Inhumans player could also try to negate this. So like, of course, it's not like if it's easier said than done, but just saying, right, I would be aiming for those round 3-4 victories on that scenario combination as the Avenger player, for instance. And as the Inhumans player, my goal would be to try to stop this from happening as much as possible and to let my superior-ish attrition get in over time, but that's easier said than done. All right, so I hope this helps everyone understand some key concepts for the game better about the pacing. We're gonna, in the future, do more of those like videos about certain aspects of the game that are a bit more nuanced. Feel free to leave a comment below if you've got any more questions on the subject that you'd like to be and thanks for watching.